hosting what I'm informally calling the second meeting of the OSU Colin Koopman fan club, because we had him come for a visit last year, where he talked about his work on info power, and it went really well. We were really excited to work with one of our Oregonian philosopher colleagues, and so we invited him to come back for a symposium on his book, Genealogy as Critique, Foucault and the Problems of Modernity. So this symposium is presented to you by the Phronesis Lab for Engaged Ethics. Our website is here for you to look at, which I'll take down in a minute, but you can visit us at oregonstate.edu/phronesis. It's housed in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, and we support ethics research that is interdisciplinary, innovative, and engaged with a focus on social justice, and our projects align with OSU's signature areas of distinction. So you can learn more about our projects here, but today what we're going to be looking at is the relationship between Foucault's work, his methods, and some on pragmatism. And so I have titled my presentation, How to Do Things with Foucault with Colin Koopman. So just as a paying tribute to Colin's work on info power, I have added some of the popular uses of Foucault on the internet. So this is the Hey Boy series. And I see my role as the organizer of this event to give you a little bit of an introduction to the thesis of the book, some background to the readings of Foucault that Colin is responding to, and then to make it a little bit more concrete, give you an example of how some of these ideas make a difference in the kind of research that I do within disability studies. So again, we are honoring the work of Colin Koopman. He's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon. I will be the first speaker. I am an assistant professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, and will be followed by my colleague Sharyn Clough, who is an associate professor in the same School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And then Evan Gottlieb will give his commentary. He is an associate professor of English. And then Colin will graciously respond to our comments.
Stephanie,
yes.
Didn't you suggest that I go last? I think you did.
Oh, yeah, so Sharyn has corrected my order, yes. We're gonna be me, then Evan, then Sharyn, then Colin. Okay, so some thoughts on how to do things with Foucault. Just because not everyone here in the audience might be either familiar with Foucault's work or Colin's work on Foucault, I just want to give you a little bit of background to understand the context that we're responding to. So Colin's work is an intervention into what he terms a common misreading of Foucault's work, which I think he rightly identifies. And that's that Foucault's work is divided into three very clear different periods between his early, middle, and late work. And that these periods are associated with specific methodologies that are seen as being isolated and distinct from one another. And the reasons why I think Colin's rereading of this is really important is that there's some nefarious consequences that come out of this periodization of Foucault's work, and that's that Foucault's methodologies are seen as not being related to one another, and that this can often then result in the dismissal of Foucault's later work on ethics and problematization, because he can be read as contradicting his own work or dismissing some of his earlier work in favor of a new method. And so I'd like to tell you what the typical story is of how Foucault's methods get parsed out into these different periods before we go on to Colin's rereading of them. So the first method and period of Foucault's work is associated with archaeology. So as the story goes, so this is seen as Foucault's early work. It's representative of his work in The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge. And that this method focuses primarily on analyzing knowledge through discourse formations and systems of thought. So the second period, which is associated with the method of genealogy, is represented in the works such as Discipline and Punish, the first volume of The History of Sexuality, and this method is associated with the analysis of power. And then The third method and third period in his later work is characterized by problematization, which can be seen in some of his published works, including the second and third volumes of the History of Sexuality, which is the use of pleasure and the care of self. And this is associated with his work on ethics. So, just as for a little levity, but also I think this characterizes this sort of periodization of Foucault. We have, hey boy, I moved from archaeology to genealogy because rules regarding the formation of statements are less interesting than the ways in which we act upon discursive constituted objects like you. And so, right, this just shows how popular this reading and periodization of Foucault's work is, that he uses archaeology, becomes somewhat dissatisfied with it in a certain way, then moves on to genealogy, and then abandons that for problematization and analysis of ethics through ancient Greek and Roman ethics. And
so Stephanie, you didn't make this one? This was available?
Oh, I didn't make this. No, I just took this off the internet.
Wow.
So there's a whole Tumblr devoted to these images.
Well, that's why I thought you actually made one up for this, but this is good evidence of the story,
yeah,
right?
This is how popular this misreading of Foucault that Colin is making an intervention into, is that it has ended up as a...
There was some other Foucault scholar who
right,
did
who
it.
doesn't know what the hell they're talking about.
So, Colin Koopman's thesis, right? So he wants us to, rather than seeing these periods of Foucault's work and the methods and concepts that he works with as distinct moments, he wants us to think of the ways in which they are working together and interlacing. His thesis is that genealogy at its best involves a practice of critique in the form of historical problematization of the present. This is bringing Foucault's work in line with Immanuel Kant's work on critique from a historical rather than a transcendental perspective. And so rather than seeing archaeology, genealogy, and problematization as distinct methods, Colin argues that archaeology, rather than genealogy, rather than dismissing archaeology or moving beyond it or using genealogy instead of archaeology, that genealogy is really archaeology plus genealogy. Right? They're informing one another and interworking in a way that is productive rather than contradictory. And so genealogy can be seen as an expansion of Foucault's work on archaeology, which is another way of saying that it widens the analysis, both in its methods and also objects. And what's important about this is that we're able to see knowledge and power rather than as being distinct from one another, but rather as being co-produced. And so the term that he uses is that the methodologies are interlaced with one another. And what I like about this terminology is the way that it shows how they're intertwined with one another. To give you a quote that demonstrates this, an analytic enabling temporal multiplicity, so as to embrace both rupture and continuity in history, and an analytic for attending to the relations between multiple vectors of power, such as power and knowledge, rather than any one of these vectors or dimensions on its own. Right? So rather than seeing genealogy and archaeology as being distinct in their methods, that when they come together, we're able to look at the ways in which both temporal rupture and emergence are important in our historical accounts of the ways that power and knowledge are co-produced in relationship to one another. And then problematization comes in not as a third form of inquiry, right, but that it is, in his words, one might take up alongside archaeology and genealogy. It is rather a methodological orientation which thoroughly inflects both. So in this reading that Colin has given us, problematization is not a third new method, but rather it is an outcome of incorporating genealogy and archaeology together. So, some advantages that come with this reading of Foucault's work. The first is what I'm calling an effective change in how we read Foucault, which is another way of saying Colin's book reminds me what I love so much about Foucault. Right? That when I first started reading Foucault, I found this expression of hope in his work for a better future that oftentimes gets left out of a lot of the readings of his work, especially when it's read through this periodization that Colin is trying to get us out of. So Foucault is often seen as being sort of a really depressing determinist, and that his work erases any possibility for freedom or agency. So one example of this comes from Linda Martine Alcoff's work. She says that it is difficult to understand how agency can be formulated on this view. Given the enormous productive efficacy Foucault accords to power knowledge or the dominant discourse, there could be agency only if human beings were given the causal ability to create, affect, and transform power knowledges or discourse. But Foucault does not concede to us this capacity. If Foucault's analysis of subjectivity is correct, a feminist emancipatory project is in trouble. So if we focus on any just one single period of Foucault's work, we end up with a Foucault that doesn't give us a lot of room for freedom or transforming the world around us. Colin Koopman's Foucault is both creative and hopeful. The images that I have here are, what I had in mind while I was reading his book is actually Nietzsche's 3 Metamorphoses from Thus Spoke Zarathustra of the beast of burden, or the sort of camel who carries around the demands and moral obligations of others, and it's a disciplined subject. The lion is the beast who says no, right, and resists everything around him or her. And then the third metamorphosis is the child who creates out of joy and hope and play, right? And so I just had this distinct memory of that passage of Nietzsche's work as I was reading Colin's book of Foucault, because it makes me think that the Foucault that he gives us is one who does philosophy and history out of love and joy and a desire to make the world a better place. So this is the victory baby. You might recognize this face from the internet. And so I made this one. Problematized, transform self. The second account, ways in which I find Colin's rereading of Foucault particularly helpful, is that I think he gives us a really robust account of the method of problematization. And this is important because there's not a lot of really in-depth accounts of this method, because it's not seen as being the culmination of Foucault's work in a way that I think Colin hands it to us. But also, because he gives us problematization in a way that accounts for it as a methodology rather than a concept. Right? A lot of readings of Foucault are very concept heavy and focus on things like docile bodies, biopower, power itself. And as Colin tells us, Foucault doesn't give us a theory of power. He gives us a method for an analytic. And he's one of the ways he describes this in the introduction to his book, is that genealogy is primarily a methodology or diagnostic toolkit. Really like this reading of Foucault because it's therefore a guide for cultural critical philosophy, which is Colin's term for philosophy at its best. Right? This is when philosophy is doing what it should be, what it's doing. This gets us beyond what Colin calls biopower hunting, which is taking the concept of biopower and then searching for examples of it and applying the concept to sort of new cases, but it never produces anything new. It just applies the same concept over and over again. And also, what is helpful about this robust account of problematization is that Foucault's ethical work in this view is no longer seen as anomalous in relationship to his other work. Right? There's something very important about the role of ethics here. And then relatedly, another advantage that I see of this reading is that is easily summarized in the distinction that Colin calls that versus how, which is a way of giving us a more nuanced account of historical contingency as found in Foucault's work. To quote Koopman, the crucial difference is between showing that the present is contingent and showing how the present is contingently made up. Right? So we can show that through Foucault's work, that sexuality or the role of prisons or our construction of madness in the present, right, is historically contingent. But that isn't all that interesting beyond knowing that it can be otherwise, right? But when we show how it's contingent, right, when Foucault shows us how it's contingent, it demands a response from us, right? Ways that we can act differently. It reveals the conditions of the possibility of the present, which is the importance of the Kantian tradition for Foucault, as Colin explains. And it also gives us a map for transformation, right? If we know what the weak points are in the within the present moment, right? If we know the places where the road towards now could have gone differently, or the debates that existed over institutions or practices that we now find natural existed, we know where the room is for action. And so genealogy, as Colin rereads it, is a history of the present for the future. So I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to gloss through this, sort of how this plays out in disability studies, but to give you a very, very quick crash course to what the field of disability studies is. Right? It's a multidisciplinary field that looks at disability as a natural form of human diversity, right? Rather than seeing disability as pathology or something that is inherently bad. We look at it as on the continuum of human vulnerability and embodied ways of being. And so that means that we study disability through a lens of power relations. And it's an attempt to move beyond simply the medical model of disability, to find other ways for thinking and talking and practicing disability that gets beyond the badness. So Foucault is actually really, his work is very ubiquitous in the field of disability studies. But I think if you take a look at Colin's description of the common misreadings of Foucault's work, those common misreadings are very popular within this field. So it's very concept heavy. There's a lot of focus on concepts such as docile bodies, biopower, normalization, discipline, rather than the methods that Foucault gives us. Specifically, problematization is pretty much ignored. Right? There's not a lot of focus on Foucault's ethical work because it sort of exclusively focuses on genealogy and archaeology. So just to give you some examples, or what results from this reading, is that when Foucault's work is concept heavy and focused on this periodization, it becomes very easy to dismiss Foucault's work as dangerous because there's no room for freedom or bodily agency. So you can see this in David Mitchell and Sharyn Snyder's work, where they write, disabled communities that are defined by virtue of the presence of physical differences will be very hard pressed to utilize the same rhetorical tactic. Or in Bill Hughes's work, he talks about how that in Foucault the body is something that's passive and without agency. And you can only get this understanding of Foucault if you limit your understanding of his work to one period. And this is what Colin wants us to get outside of. Oftentimes Foucault's work is dehistoricized in this field as well. Concepts are often extracted from the historical and methodological context in Foucault's work. Just two examples to give you. Biopower is sometimes used as a overarching concept to talk about the ways in which human subjects are normalized, rather than as a historically contingent form of power that emerges in the late 18th, early 19th century for Foucault. The same thing happens with docile bodies. So why does this matter? I think that what we see with these readings is that we get the loss of the creative, joyful Foucault by return to a determinist reading of Foucault. We lose the power of his methods that are associated with the tactics and methods for transformation. And specifically because we lose that distinction between that versus how disability is something that is historically contingent. Just to close out, a couple of questions that came as a result of thinking about Colin's work in relationship to disability studies. One of the things I was really struck by was how Colin's reading of Foucault really helps me return to the creative, powerful, transformative potential that I find in Foucault's work. And this really contrasts with Colin's characterization of Foucault's methods as non-normative. And so if we have time for a conversation, I'd like to just return to that, right? How can I find this enormous transformative potential for other ways of being disabled in the world if Foucault's work is non-normative, as Colin happens to say? So I'm just curious what he thinks about sort of the ethical power of Foucault's work. And now I will turn over to my colleague, Gottlieb.